Okay, so this is the first video in what is going to be a series about rationality. And I'm pretty much going to be just following this book by Steven Pinker. So it came out late last year. So Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, why it matters by Steven Pinker. And it does a really good job of giving sort of an introduction to a lot of areas in rationality, things like logic and game theory and decision theory and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm pretty much going to be using this as my guideline and going through all of those subjects. Some of them I'll probably expand on, particularly logic, which is a subject that I'm actually quite familiar with, so I can probably offer quite a bit more on that subject than the sort of introduction that Pinker gives in his book. But like I said, I'll be pretty much following this book. I'll probably even be putting lots of quotes from this book into my presentation here. And so if you are interested in this subject, I definitely recommend this book. So I have also left a review for this book on my blog here, so you can check out sort of what I already think about the book there. And for the most part, I really like the book. There are some things, I guess, sort of philosophically that I disagree with Pinker on, but that's sort of besides the point here. And so I'm actually going to start off with something that's kind of not right in his book, and that is sort of what a definition of rationality actually is. And so these are sort of definitions that I came up with. I mean, I think they're probably close to what you'll find in most treatments of the subject, but for me, I think there are sort of two ways that you could kind of define rationality. And so the first one is this sort of idea of rational self-interest. And so this would be characterized by an ability to determine what goals a person ought to have in order to maximize their well-being. And the second part would be the ability to determine what actions one must take in order to achieve those goals. And so, that's the idea that, well, the first part would be something like, like what goals should I have? And there are certainly goals that people would think are rational. For instance, making more money might be a rational decision, whereas, or a rational goal rather, whereas something like, doing heroin might be sort of a bad or irrational goal for somebody to have in order to maximize well-being. Then, of course, there is the ability to determine what actions one must take in order to achieve those goals. And so you can see how, that has to sort of also have part one in it, because somebody who is a heroin addict might be really good at finding how to get heroin and being able to achieve that goal, but we wouldn't really call that rational, because doing heroin is kind of an irrational goal. Whereas somebody who knows what actions they have to take in order to make more money, might be, that would be seen as rational, because the goal itself is rational and the actions that a person knows to take would be rational. And so another perhaps definition of rationality would be, and this is probably one that is, thought of quite often, sort of when people are just thinking of rationality and, saying that somebody is being irrational, or saying that somebody is, very rational. And so this would be a good faith interest in determining the truth. And so I say good faith because, you can think of somebody who has like ulterior motives in wanting to find the truth, or the quote unquote truth, and maybe they even come to believe that that is the truth. But a good faith interest is sort of the idea that I'm actually interested in knowing what the truth is, even if it's something that I might not like. Then the second part is the ability to discern justified belief from an unjustified belief. And there could be a ton of philosophical background on what is meant by justified belief and unjustified belief. But a justified belief, so you can think of in philosophy, there is this idea called justified true belief, or JTB. And so there can be something that happens to be true and you also happen to believe it, but that doesn't mean that you are necessarily justified in believing it. And so my favorite example of this is, say you have a clock, and say it's saying that it is, like what the minute hand is pointing up and the hour hand is pointing down. So it's saying that it is 6 o'clock. And so you look at the clock, you form the belief that it is 6 o'clock, and it also just happens to be true that it is 6 o'clock. But are you justified in this belief? Because what if the clock is broken? What if it stopped at 6 o'clock? But it just so happens that when you look at the clock, it is 6 o'clock. Would you say that you were justified in believing that it's 6 o'clock? When, even if it was 7 o'clock and you looked at the clock, you might form the belief that it's 6 o'clock. And so, that's the idea of justification. What justifies you in believing that it is 6 o'clock? What is the difference between a belief that just happens to be true and a belief that is true that you were also justified in believing? And so this is kind of the second part of this definition, is that you are able to determine that a belief is justified, or you were able to determine if a belief is unjustified. And so that is sort of my accurate belief formation definition of rationality. And so both of these definitions, there's a lot of overlap to them, in that, you know, determining like rational goals means being able to determine, what is true, and being able to determine what is justified and things like that. And, being able to determine what actions to take means that, certain actions, it is true that that action will bring about a goal that maximizes well-being. And so there's a bit of overlap to these, but I just wanted to point out, like I said, this part here is not in Steven Pinker's book directly. This is sort of my two working definitions of what rationality is. But let's get into the book itself. And so I'm actually going to go through some, I guess you could say, puzzles that show up in the first chapter of Steven Pinker's book. And I'm going to just lay out the puzzles here, and then I am going to go through sort of the answers to the puzzles and sort of what part of our sort of rational faculties are going wrong when people often get these things wrong. That's why these puzzles are sort of famous. And so they're seen as sort of ways that humans are irrational, and that we are not, completely rational animals. And like I said, these puzzles come directly from the first chapter of Steven Pinker's book. So I'll go through the puzzles and just lay out the puzzles. If you want to, I encourage you to sort of think about these puzzles and come up with your own answers before listening to the part of this video that goes through what the actual answers are. So that you can sort of, get a better understanding of sort of where our faculties go wrong. So the first one is, so we have a smartphone and a case. So the smartphone itself costs $100, or it's $100 more rather than the case. So I guess I should have put that this is $100 more than the case. So the phone costs $100 more than the case, and two of them together, so that plus that equals $110. So how much does the case cost? And so, like I said, I want you to think about that. I will go over the answers to all these here in a little bit, but I'm just going to lay out all these all these little puzzles, I guess you could call them. All right, so number two, it takes 8 printers 8 minutes to print 8 brochures. How long would it take for 24 printers to print 24 brochures? And so, like I said, think about this. Try to come up with what you think the answer would be, you know, and then, I mean, you're probably already going to know that the answer is somewhat unintuitive just because these are, I've already said that these are kind of like puzzles. But just sort of don't put too much thought in it. Just go with your first sort of gut instinct and say, what you think the answer would be. Then I'll sort of talk about why, sort of our gut instinct answers are often wrong. All right, so then the third one, on a field there is a patch of weeds. So maybe you can see the little green dot there. So say this box is our field. And then it says it takes 30 days for the patch to cover the entire field. So on this side, after 30 days, our entire field is covered with weeds. How long did it take for the patch to cover half the field? All right, so that is the third one there. All right, consider the following problem. If a coin has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other. So we have this if-then statement. If vowel on one side, then even number on the other. Which coins down below do you have to turn over to determine whether the rule has been violated? So we have this one here, which is a vowel. We have a consonant. We have an odd number. And we have an even number. And so which of these coins would you have to turn over in order to find out that the rule if vowel then even number has been violated? Then, of course, there is the famous Monty Hall problem. So you're on a game show and there are 3 doors. You don't know what's behind any of the doors, but you know one of them has a car behind it and the other 2 have goats. When you pick one, so say you pick door number 1, then the host opens one of the other doors, so the host opens door 3 and shows you that there is a goat behind it, and then says, are you going to stick with your guess of number 1 or are you going to switch to number 2? So what would you do in this situation? All right, and then number 6 here. So the idea is to rate each possible situation. So each of these letters is a possible situation with one of the following. Is there a less than a 0.01% chance of it happening, or is there a 0.1%, 0.5, 1, 2, 5, 10, 25, or 50% or more chance of it happening? And so the first situation is, what is the chance that Saudi Arabia develops a nuclear weapon? The second one, what is the chance that Nicolas Maduro resigns as president of Venezuela? And C, what is the chance that Russia has a female president? And D, what is the chance that the world suffers a new and more lethal strain of COVID-19? Then part E, what is the chance that Vladimir Putin is constitutionally prevented from running for another term as president? Which I think, sort of given what's actually going on now, and Pinker wouldn't have known this when he wrote the book, but I think a lot of people would like to see Vladimir Putin not be president anymore. But anyway, what is the chance that Vladimir Putin is constitutionally prevented from running for another term as president of Russia, and his wife takes his place on the ballot, allowing him to run the country from the sidelines? Then so for part F, what is the chance that we have massive strikes and riots in Venezuela that force Nicolas Maduro to resign as president of Venezuela? Then part G, What is the chance that there is a respiratory virus that jumps from bats to humans in China and starts a new and even more lethal pandemic than COVID-19? And finally, part H. What are the chances that after Iran develops a nuclear weapon and tests it in an underground explosion, Saudi Arabia develops its own nuclear weapon in response? And so, like I said, think about each of these six little puzzles here before watching the rest of this video. And so I'll assume maybe you've paused it or you've been sort of going along with this and sort of going through it on your own as I talk about it. And now I'll talk about sort of the answers to this. And so for the first case, if you have your phone and your case, they cost $110 in total. The phone costs $100 more than the case. How much does the case cost? And so it should be it should cost $5 because $105 minus $5 is equal to that $100 difference. And so Pinker says that people are fooled by sort of the round numbers. I think a lot of people think, so you have $110 total, and the phone costs $100 more, then the case must cost $10. But we can see that then this is only $90 more than the $10, and so it actually needs to cost $5. But people can get fooled by sort of those round numbers there. So the number two, it takes 8 minutes for 24 printers to print 24 brochures. So remember, we said if it takes 8 printers 8 minutes to print 8 brochures, how long would it take for 24 printers to print 24 brochures? And so the reason for this is that it takes a printer 8 minutes to print a single brochure. And so as long as there are as many printers as there are brochures and they are working simultaneously, it'll take the same amount of time. And so people are fooled by the number of printers being the same as the number of minutes. But it would take 8 minutes because there are 24 printers. Each one is printing one brochure. They're doing it simultaneously. But we know that it takes 8 minutes for one printer to print one brochure. And so it should still take 8 minutes. All right, and then so number three, we had over here in a field, there's a patch of weeds. Every day it doubles in size. It takes 30 days to cover the whole field. How long should it take to cover half the field? Well, it should take 29 days to cover half the field. So we go over here, we have our little patch. After 29 days, it covers half the field because going from day 29 to 30 is when it doubles, and then we are covering the whole field with our weeds. And so humans tend to be bad at thinking exponentially. So Pinker talks about how, a lot of times people intuitively think of exponential as just being sort of a slight acceleration, but the acceleration can be quite explosive, where we see it takes 29 days just to cover one half of the field. So we have this sort of slow buildup, but then we have sort of this explosion at the end, where then it takes only a single day to go from half of it to the full field being covered. And so people tend to be bad at thinking exponentially. And so Pinker says that 5 out of 6 people get at least one of these three puzzles here wrong, and that 1 in 3 get all of them wrong. So Pinker says that this is more out of thoughtlessness than ineptitude, because even when really intelligent people, like they give it to, like people who are college students at like MIT and things like that, still get this wrong. And so this is, so Daniel Kahneman, who is a behavioral economist has called this System 1 and System 2, where System 1 is sort of our intuitive way of thinking of things. And so that's sort of our thinking fast. So it's from his book Thinking Fast and Slow. And so System 1 is sort of our fast thinking, and it's sort of the intuitive, but it's not always right, especially in cases like this, where System 2 is sort of our thinking slow, where where we can sort of puzzle things out and sort of dig down deep. And so Kahneman says that System 1 is sort of our preferred way of thinking about things. People tend not to like to think with System 2 because it's a lot more cognitively taxing. And so that's the reason why people often come up with sort of wrong or irrational answers to these things. And so then in our coin puzzle here, so we said we have these coins, and if a coin has a vowel, then it has an even number on the other side. We said which ones do we have to flip over to see that the rule has been violated. The rule being if vowel on one side, then even number on the other. And so what you have to do is flip over A and then 3. So we want to turn over A because if there's no even number on the other side, then the rule has been violated. But we also want to flip over 3 because if we find a vowel on the other side, then the rule has been violated. So everyone seems to know that flipping over B will give us no information. But many think that flipping over 4 will give the information. But that's because a lot of times people think that if vowel then even entails if even then vowel, but saying that if vowel then even does not entail if even then vowel. And so this has to do with logic of the if-then statements, in particular modus ponens, and modus tollens, where modus ponens is affirm the antecedent. So affirm. I guess we can say the if part, and modus tollens is negate. So negate the then part of it. And so it's kind of this idea that, say, if we say if rain, then wet. And so we know that if we say yes, it is raining, then we know that, well, then it's going to be wet outside. But if we say that it's wet outside, we don't know that that necessarily means rain. It could mean that somebody has a sprinkler on, for instance. But we can say that if it's not wet, then it definitely has not rained outside. And so I'll get more into this in a future video when I go through logic here. So this is kind of a logic thing. And so Pinker says that only 10% of people actually get this right. So Steven Pinker says that the problem is misleading because it doesn't appeal to our human intuitions, such as picking out unfairness. So if we consider the following, which is just sort of doing the same puzzle, but kind of with different words, essentially. So if a letter is labeled express mail, then it must have a $10 stamp. So the label and stamp must be on the opposite side of the envelope. If you are a postal worker, which envelopes do you want to turn over to see if people are following the rule? And so most people know that it's express and 50 cents. So we want to flip over the express to see if it has a $10 stamp on the other side. But people will also know that we have to flip over the 50 cent because people are good at, thinking, well, I want to see if this person who's putting a 50 cent stamp on the envelope is, sort of playing fair. We don't want somebody getting away with something, using a cheaper stamp while also getting the benefit of express mail. And so Steven Pinker says that if we are given this sort of puzzle with something that sort of appeals to our fairness, our sense of fairness, then we are better at this. And so this kind of goes in with Steven Pinker's um, sort of thesis in his book that humans aren't actually as irrational as people like Kahneman think they are, which I kind of tend to disagree with, but that is um, somewhat beside the point. I mean, because Pinker says that if we, appeal to our sense of fairness, then people are better at getting this right. But, I mean, that's sort of kind of, I don't know, it's kind of saying that, well, you're just not asking the problem right. And it's like, well, if people were rational, then it shouldn't have to appeal to our emotions, essentially, in order for us to get this right. But anyway, I'll talk about that kind of stuff and where I sort of disagree with Steven Pinker in future videos. But the idea, but the point is that people are better at getting it right when it can appeal to like our sense of fairness, for instance. All right, and so then we want to go back to the Monty Hall problem. So the famous Monty Hall problem, you're in a game show and there are three doors. You know that one of them has a car behind it, two of them have goats. So say you choose door one, then the host opens one of the other doors and shows that it's a goat. Do you want to switch doors? And so the correct answer, the rational answer would be yes, you should change your guess. So you're picking the doors, and say you pick door one, which has a third chance of being of having the car behind the player's pick if they pick door one. There's a two-thirds chance of it being behind either door two or three. So the host opens up door three and shows you that there's a goat there. That two-thirds is now only on door two. And so now there's a one-third chance that your pick is right and a two-thirds chance that the other door is the right one. And so you should flip over. You should change your guess to the other one. I think a lot of people get this wrong because they think, well, once the host opens this door and shows the goat, then it must be 50-50 between these two things, but that's not actually the case. And so this is a famous problem because back in the 90s, this woman in the paper, I forget her name, but she was supposed to be, like the smartest woman on earth, and she pointed this out, and there was a lot of people who were actually quite angry at her and saying that that can't be true. It has to be 50-50, and it turned out that she was vindicated. But so let's look at this. So behind door one, door two, and door three. So these are the three possible things that it could be. So the result if staying at door number one. So if we do this where you choose one and then we have one of the other ones opened. So in case one here, so if you stay on one, then you'll get the goat. If you stay on one here, so in this one, the host opens this door and shows the goat. On this one, the host opens this one and shows the goat. So there are two ways here where if you stay, then you win a goat, or if you switch, you win the car. Whereas there's only this one chance here where if you change, then you get the goat, or if you stay, you win the car. And so it's actually a two-thirds chance of winning if you switch your guess. All right, and then so this last one here, where we looked at these different situations and wanted to determine sort of what the chances are of it. So in this one, a lot of people tend to put more weight, put more percent chance of it happening in these bottom ones because these offer some kind of narrative that sort of appeals to our sense of narrative. But what's actually the case, so people are often fooled by events that have a backstory, but a conjunction of events has to be equally or less likely than a disjunction. So uh, a conjunction being the probability of A and B has to be less than or equal to the probability of A or B. So we could have this where A and B is less than the chance of A or B, but the highest it could ever be is the probability of A and B being exactly equal to the probability of A or B. So if we look at this, so we have, for instance, the probability of a Russian female president, i.e. Putin's wife, and the probability that Putin resigns has to be less than the probability of a Russian female president or the probability that Putin resigns. So if we look at the Venn diagram here, so the Russia female president and Putin resigns. So these have to be larger than or at most exactly equal to each other, exactly equal to the conjunction of both of them happening. And so if we look at one of the other examples, so the probability that Maduro resigns and that there are massive strikes has to be less than, or I guess you could say equal to, and we could say equal to on here. So less than or equal to the probability that Maduro resigns or that there are massive strikes. And so we can see there's the probability that Maduro resigns as president and the probability or the probability of massive strikes. And then only at the overlap is there the and here. So the probability that Maduro resigns and there are massive strikes. And as I said, the most that you could ever have is equal. But people are often fooled. So we see something like this, like, Vladimir Putin is constitutionally prevented from running for another term as president of Russia, and his wife takes place on the ballot, allowing him to run the country from the sidelines. That sort of appeals to this idea that, oh yeah, that story sounds like it. That sounds exactly like something that Putin would do. That's exactly, sort of the kind of thing that Putin would do. But, that would also entail that there is a female president. But it's also the case that there could be some other thing that happens where Russia ends up with a female president than, this particular situation happening. But, that doesn't appeal to our sense of, something that we would think of Putin actually doing. But anyway, so this is sort of how this last puzzle here goes, and so it kind of is that idea too that people are bad at sort of probabilities, both with the Monty Hall problem and with this one here, where people are bad at opportunity or probabilities rather when especially when something appeals to sort of our human sense of having like a narrative or a backstory to something, rather than just sort of the raw probability of Russia having a female president. But anyway, those are some of the things that Steven Pinker goes through in his first chapter of his book Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, and why it matters. So in the next few videos in this playlist, I'll be going through some of the different chapters in his book, which in fact I'll look in the book here, and so the chapters. So the third chapter is logic and critical thinking, so I'll have probably a few videos on that. The fourth chapter is probability and randomness. The fifth is belief in evidence, in other words, Bayesian reasoning. The sixth is risk and reward, so things like rational choice and expected utility. The seventh is hits and false alarms, so signal detection and statistical decision theory. And then there eight is self and others, which is about game theory. Then chapter nine is correlation and causation. Then I'll probably make a video or two going over particularly his 10th chapter, which is just titled What's Wrong with People. But anyway, it'll probably be, at least one video or more for each of those chapters. And as I said, particularly the logic one, I might end up expanding on quite a bit since that's a subject I'm somewhat familiar with. But anyway, this video is already getting too long. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it starts making you think about what rationality is and, you know, essentially how you can be more rational and why rationality is important. And I will see you in the next video.